November 12th, 1912, a troop of shivering men and mules struggle through the biting Antarctic wind. They came here on an epic quest of discovery, but now they are on a desperate rescue mission. 5 men from their company set out on a final push to make history as the first expedition to reach the South Pole, but none have returned. Up ahead in the distance, through the blowing drifts of snow, the men see something that raises their spirits. As they trudge closer, they realize it's a tent. Their lost comrades might have survived the grueling Antarctic winter. After all, when they open the flap, their hearts sink to their boots. Inside, they find 3 men, all dead, frozen to the bone. They also find photographs, personal effects, and 35 pounds of rock and ice samples. The rescuers build a snowy cairn over the tent and snap a pair of skis to erect a makeshift cross. But one mystery still remains. Where are the other 2 men? A little further south, they find a sleeping bag in the snow, but no sleeper. What in the world went wrong? In 1910, 2 great explorers set out to reach the South Pole. It was a race for history, glory, and national pride. But for one of the parties, it ended in disaster. This is the story of Amundsen versus Scott, the legendary race to conquer Antarctica. Welcome to History Snob. At the beginning of the 20th century, the South Pole was Earth's final frontier. In the 19th century, the great European powers had explored and conquered most of the known world, but Antarctica's secrets remained undiscovered. What wonders lurked in its snowy mountains? What ancient mysteries were buried under its ice sheets? No one knew. Everyone wanted to find out, and everyone wanted to be the first to plant their flag on the South Pole, to conquer the world's last truly untouched wilderness. Whoever got there first would win glory for his country and an eternal place in history for himself. 2 men were about to make the attempt. They would both secure their places in history, but for very different reasons. Roald Amundsen was a meticulous Norwegian explorer who was already celebrated as the first man to traverse the Northwest Passage. Obsessed with polar travel since his youth, he trained obsessively, studying indigenous Arctic survival techniques and favoring a minimalist, calculated approach. Of course, there were no indigenous people to help him in Antarctica, only vast empty space and penguins. Robert Falcon Scott was a British naval officer, driven by duty, conquest, and dreams of his own legacy. He had led a previous Antarctic expedition in 1902, gaining valuable experience and becoming a national hero back in the UK. He returned to Antarctica with the Terra Nova expedition in 1910, carrying not just hopes for a polar triumph, but also a heavy load of scientific goals and imperial ambitions. These 2 men would soon find themselves engaged in the greatest race of all time, Britain versus Norway. But this race wasn't just a difference between flags. Both men were smart, calculated, and hungry to make history, but they were fundamentally different. Amundsen and Scott had different ideologies, tactics, and leadership styles. These would be tested to their limits in the journey to come. Both men would face the full fury of Antarctica, and only one would come out alive. Scott's Terra Nova expedition was grand in scale, over 60 men strong. His team included meteorologists, biologists, and geologists, many of whom played key roles in the collection of specimens and data. Among them were Dr. Edward Wilson, a gifted naturalist and Scott's close friend, Lieutenant Henry Bowers, known for his tireless energy, and Petty Officer Edgar Evans, a physically strong seaman picked for his endurance. For transportation, Scott brought a mix of motor sledges, which were experimental and untested in such extreme cold, Manchurian ponies who had never experienced such icy terrain, and a few sled dogs. Scott's choices would prove significant later on. Amundsen's team was far leaner, with just 19 men, all carefully selected for their specific skills. His right-hand man was Roald, a master carpenter and skier who helped redesign and lighten their sleds. Helmer Hansen, another experienced dog driver from Amundsen's Northwest Passage expedition, led the charge with the dog teams. Amundsen's brought 52 Greenland dogs. Knowing their stamina and cold weather resilience would be essential, he based every decision on what had worked for him in the far north. Sled dogs, skis, and lots of fur clothing. His minimalist approach left little room for error. His team was small, and he was entirely reliant on the strength and courage of his dogs. While Scott labored to secure government support and coordinated with the Royal Geographic Society, Amundsen secretly outfitted his ship, Fram, a vessel uniquely designed for polar conditions with a rounded hull to resist ice pressure. He told the public he was headed for the Arctic. In reality, he diverted south without notifying even his own crew until they were en route. Scott set up a base at McMurdo Sound, a familiar location from his earlier expedition but farther from the pole. Amundsen established Framheim at the Bay of Whales, some 60 miles closer to the South Pole and situated on the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf. Neither man knew it, but their fates were already sealed by their choices. Amundsen departed his Framheim base on October 19, 1911. His strategy was straightforward but brilliant. He planned meticulously to move fast and stay light, avoiding unnecessary burdens. His dog teams were used to Arctic conditions, and the sleds they had to pull were effortlessly light. But of course, dogs are animals, and Amundsen had no mechanized means of transportation as backup. Amundsen set a strict daily schedule, aiming for 15 to 20 miles of progress per day, depending on the conditions. He had placed supply depots at carefully calculated intervals on the route, ensuring his team could travel without being weighed down by too many supplies. As we mentioned, Amundsen had a head start because he began his journey closer to the pole, but he also cleverly designed his route to be as flat as possible, so the dogs wouldn't have to trudge up and down hills. Scott began his quest later, on November 1st, 1911, from his Cape Evans base. His plan was more complicated, more reliant on technology. Scott intended to use his motorized sleds for the first part of the trek, then switch to ponies. In the final phase, his team would resort to dragging their sleds themselves. If everything went according to plan, his mechanized sleds would give him a head start, and the power of his ponies and his large team would carry him over the finish line. His supply depots had been placed far apart to save time, but Scott's team soon faced disaster. The motorized sledges he had dragged all the way to Antarctica failed him early in the mission. The ponies he brought with him couldn't handle the frigid conditions either. Before long, Scott and his men were forced to drag their sleds under their own power. While Scott's party trudged slowly south, Amundsen's team executed their plan with near perfect efficiency. With carefully spaced depots and expertly trained dog teams, they crossed the Ross Ice Shelf and ascended the previously unexplored Axel Heiberg Glacier with relative ease. Scott took a more traditional path via the Beardmore Glacier. It was more familiar, but longer, higher, and more grueling. Scott surely knew his expedition was in trouble, but he couldn't have known the extent of the disaster that was coming. Amundsen reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911. The team spent 3 days verifying their position, planting the Norwegian flag, and taking photographs. Before departing, Amundsen left a tent containing 2 letters, one addressed to King Håkon VII of Norway and another specifically for Scott. Amundsen's letter to Scott was courteous but matter-of-fact. It confirmed that the Norwegian team had arrived first and left the location in good order. The message read, "Dear Captain Scott, as you were probably the first to reach this area after us, I will ask you kindly to deliver this letter to King Hakon VII. If you should be so unfortunate as to meet with any misadventure, please make sure this message is forwarded as soon as possible. It was a gesture of respect, even in competition, but it underscored the finality of Scott's loss. Amundsen returned to Framheim by January 25th, 1912, without losing a single man. Scott reached the pole on January 17th, 1912. His heart sank when he saw the Norwegian flag whipping in the icy wind. He wrote in his diary, "Great God, this is an awful place and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority." In Amundsen's tent, he found the letter addressed to him. The race was over, but the true tragedy was about to begin. The return journey for Scott's team was a nightmare. Defeated by Amundsen, the 5 members of Scott's team that went with him all the way to the pole now had to retreat and rendezvous with the others. Weakened by exhaustion, malnutrition, and constant exposure to the brutal Antarctic conditions, the men deteriorated quickly as they struggled to retrace their steps. Petty Officer Edgar Evans was the first to succumb. He had been showing signs of disorientation and fatigue, and it's believed he suffered a brain injury after a fall. He died on February 17th, 1912. Next was Captain Lawrence Oates. Afflicted with severe frostbite, particularly on his feet, he could no longer keep pace with the others. Realizing he was endangering their survival, he made a fateful decision. On March 17th, he calmly stepped out of the tent into a blizzard, saying the now famous words, "I am just going outside, and may be some time." He was never seen again. It was Oates' sleeping bag that the rescue party later found, abandoned in the snow. That left 3, Scott, Dr. Edward Wilson, and Lieutenant Henry Bowers. The trio continued for a short while, but a massive blizzard trapped them in their tent around March 20th, just 11 miles from their next supply depot. Day after day, they waited for the weather to clear, but it never did. With their rations dwindling and energy spent, they were slowly overtaken by the cold. Scott's final diary entry, dated March 29th, 1912, was haunting and read, "Every day we have been ready to start for our depot, but outside the door of the tent, it remains a scene of whirling drift. We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more." Their frozen bodies were found 8 months later by a search party. Alongside them were their journals, photographs, and 35 pounds of geological specimens collected as part of the expedition's scientific mission and carried to the end. All the men involved in Scott's Terra Nova expedition faced extreme hardship, but it was this final polar party of 5, Evans, Oates, Bowers, Wilson, and Scott, who paid the ultimate price. Amundsen's success was no accident. It was the result of careful planning, smart decision-making, and an unwavering focus on survival and efficiency. And this is why he ultimately won. Amundsen relied exclusively on sled dogs, strong, fast, and perfectly adaptable to the harsh polar environment. His dogs pulled sledges across the ice with ease, and as the team advanced, some of the weaker dogs were culled and used as food for the others, reducing weight and maintaining energy. In contrast, Scott's transport plan included motorized sledges that quickly broke down, ponies that could not handle the cold, and finally, the grueling task of man-hauling heavy loads by hand. Amundsen's supply depots were spaced out with precision. He used fuel cans with soldered tops to prevent leaks, a critical detail Scott's team discovered too late, as their fuel cans had leaked because they were sealed with corks that failed in the extreme cold. This led to shortages of essential fuel on the return journey. Amundsen dressed his men in furs modeled after the Inuit, providing excellent insulation and breathability. He fed his team a high-fat diet of seal, penguin, and dog meat, rich in vitamin C to prevent scurvy. Scott's men wore woolen clothing that became damp and cold, and ate mainly tinned food, which lacked essential nutrients. Amundsen had one goal: reach the South Pole and come back alive. Scott's expedition was loaded with scientific objectives, including collecting rock samples and recording data. This added extra weight and slowed progress, making the journey even more dangerous. In the end, Amundsen was relentlessly pragmatic. Every decision was tested, calculated, and focused on survival. Scott, driven by heroism, science, and duty, took more risks and lived to regret it. In the aftermath, Amundsen was celebrated globally as a hero of the age of exploration. In 1926, he added to his accolades by becoming one of the first men to fly over the North Pole aboard the airship Norway. But just 2 years later, in 1928, tragedy struck. An Italian explorer named Umberto Nobile crashed his airship, the Italia, during a polar expedition. Amundsen volunteered to help with the search and rescue mission. He boarded a French Latham 47 seaplane along with 5 others and took off from Tromsø, Norway. Somewhere over the Barents Sea, the plane vanished without a trace. Despite extensive international search efforts, neither the aircraft nor Amundsen's body was ever found. His disappearance added a final mysterious chapter already filled with adventure and danger. Scott became a hero as well. His stoicism and bravery were lionized in Britain. The tragedy elevated him from failed explorer to national icon. Today, both men are honored at the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station, a joint American facility that bears their names. But history remembers them differently. Amundsen as the planner, the doer, the winner. Scott as the dreamer, the sufferer, the fallen hero. So there you have it. Amundsen versus Scott, the deadly race for the South Pole. Which part of the Amundsen-Scott race shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to History Snob for more weird and fascinating history facts. Thanks for watching.